He believed the simple woman standing before him would become the easiest person to embarrass in his courtroom. But before the morning ended, the most respected judge in the building would find himself questioning everything he thought he knew. The Franklin County Courthouse stood proudly in the center of Columbus, Ohio, its marble columns rising above the busy streets like a monument to authority and tradition. Every weekday morning, lawyers, clerks, and citizens passed through its heavy doors carrying stacks of documents and expectations for justice. Courtroom 4B was especially crowded that day. Attorneys filled the front rows while spectators occupied nearly every available seat. Quiet conversations echoed beneath the high ceiling as people waited for proceedings to begin. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Harold Whitman entered through the side door. The room immediately rose to its feet. Judge Whitman had spent more than 20 years on the bench and enjoyed a reputation for intelligence, discipline, and confidence. Some admired him. Others feared appearing unprepared in his courtroom. He carried himself with the certainty of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. As everyone settled into their seats, a woman quietly entered through the rear doors. She wore a simple gray cardigan, practical shoes, and carried a worn leather folder beneath one arm. Her appearance drew little attention at first. She looked like any ordinary citizen attending a public hearing. Her name was Evelyn Carter. She moved calmly through the courtroom and took a seat near the front. Several attorneys glanced at her before returning to their notes. A few spectators assumed she was there to support a family member. Nobody paid much attention. Yet there was something unusual about Evelyn. While others appeared nervous or distracted, she seemed perfectly at ease. She quietly reviewed documents inside her folder, occasionally making notes in the margins with a blue pen. Across the room, a young attorney named Daniel Pierce noticed her concentration. He assumed she must be connected to one of the cases scheduled that morning. Nearby, court clerk Melissa Grant organized files and prepared the docket. The courtroom gradually settled into silence as proceedings began. Several routine matters moved quickly. Judge Whitman handled each case with efficiency and authority. Then a legal issue arose involving procedural questions that had confused several participants. Lawyers exchanged uncertain looks. Documents were reviewed. Clarifications were requested. The discussion became increasingly complicated. During the exchange, Evelyn quietly raised her hand from the gallery. The gesture immediately drew attention. A few people looked surprised. Members of the public rarely interrupted proceedings. Judge Whitman glanced toward her with visible annoyance. His eyes moved from her simple clothing to the worn folder resting on her lap. The judge's expression revealed the conclusion he had already reached. He believed he knew exactly who she was and exactly how much she understood. The room waited. Evelyn remained calm. Judge Whitman leaned back slightly and looked directly at her. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. To him, the interruption seemed almost amusing. To everyone else, it appeared that an ordinary woman had just made a very unusual decision. What nobody realized was that within the next hour, every assumption in that courtroom would begin to collapse, one legal argument at a time. Judge Harold Whitman looked toward the woman seated in the gallery and allowed the silence to linger for a moment. Around the courtroom, attorneys paused their note-taking and spectators shifted slightly in their seats. Everyone seemed curious about what would happen next. Public interruptions during court proceedings were unusual enough. A woman dressed in a simple gray cardigan raising her hand during a complicated legal discussion was even more unusual. Judge Whitman folded his hands and studied Evelyn Carter from the bench. The faint smile on his face suggested he had already formed an opinion. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom. "This is a legal proceeding, not a town hall meeting." A few quiet chuckles emerged from the gallery. Evelyn remained calm. "I understand, Your Honor." Her respectful tone only seemed to encourage the judge. "Then perhaps you also understand that legal arguments are generally left to trained professionals." More laughter followed. Several attorneys smiled politely. Others avoided reacting altogether. Daniel Pierce glanced toward Evelyn and immediately noticed something unusual. She did not appear embarrassed. Most people would have lowered their eyes or withdrawn after becoming the focus of attention in a crowded courtroom. Evelyn simply sat upright and listened. Judge Whitman continued. "You raised your hand during a discussion involving procedural law. May I ask whether you have any formal legal training?" The question sounded innocent on the surface, but the courtroom sensed the implication beneath it. A few spectators exchanged amused looks. Evelyn paused briefly. I have spent some time studying the law. The answer triggered additional laughter. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair. Some time studying the law. He repeated the phrase slowly, as if examining it. That is a very broad description. Several people smiled. Court clerk Melissa Grant looked down at her paperwork, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Yet nobody interrupted. The judge appeared to be enjoying the moment. Well, Judge Whitman said, since you seem interested in procedural matters, perhaps you would like to explain the issue currently before the court. The challenge immediately drew attention. Lawyers turned toward Evelyn. Spectators leaned forward. Some expected her to decline. Others anticipated an awkward response that would justify the judge's skepticism. Evelyn calmly opened the worn leather folder resting on her lap. She reviewed a page briefly before looking up. The issue concerns whether the filing deadline should be measured from the date of service or the date of receipt under the revised procedural amendment. The courtroom grew slightly quieter. Several attorneys stopped smiling. The answer was accurate. Very accurate. Judge Whitman noticed the reaction immediately. His expression shifted, though only slightly. Interesting, he said. And what makes you believe that? Evelyn glanced at her notes. Because the amendment changed the interpretation adopted under the previous administrative guidance. A few attorneys exchanged surprised looks. Daniel Pierce slowly straightened in his seat. The response sounded less like the observation of an ordinary citizen and more like the analysis of someone deeply familiar with legal procedure. Yet Judge Whitman was not prepared to reconsider his assumptions. Not yet. He smiled again, this time with a sharper edge. In his mind, the woman had simply gotten lucky. One correct answer did not impress a man who had spent decades on the bench. Around the courtroom, curiosity was beginning to replace amusement. And although nobody realized it yet, the judge's next question would become the first step toward unraveling the story everyone thought they understood. Judge Harold Whitman looked down from the bench with renewed confidence. The correct answer Evelyn Carter had given moments earlier had caught his attention, but in his mind it proved very little. Over the years, he had encountered countless people who happened to know a legal term or recognize a procedural rule. One accurate observation did not make someone an expert. Around the courtroom, curiosity was growing. The laughter had faded, replaced by cautious interest. Attorneys who had ignored Evelyn earlier were now paying attention. Daniel Pierce continued watching from his seat, increasingly intrigued by the woman in the gray cardigan. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained completely calm. She sat quietly with her folder resting on her lap, showing no sign of nervousness despite being the focus of the entire room. Judge Whitman adjusted his glasses and glanced at the case documents before him. Very well, he said. Since you seem familiar with procedural amendments, perhaps you can answer another question. Several spectators exchanged looks. The judge's tone suggested that this was no longer a simple inquiry. It felt more like a challenge. Under the revised interpretation, Judge Whitman continued, what limitation applies when a filing deadline falls on a state-recognized holiday that occurs after electronic submission but before formal processing? The question immediately drew attention from every attorney present. It was not a basic issue. It involved a narrow procedural circumstance that many legal professionals rarely encountered. Some spectators looked confused. Others assumed the conversation was finally about to end. Surely this question would be too complicated. Evelyn listened carefully. She did not rush. She did not appear intimidated. After a brief pause, she opened her folder and located a page near the center. Then she looked up. The filing remains timely because submission controls, not administrative processing, provided the electronic confirmation occurred before the statutory deadline. Silence followed. Several attorneys blinked. One lawyer sitting near the front slowly lowered his pen. Another exchanged a surprised glance with a colleague. The answer was not only correct, it was precise. Judge Whitman's expression tightened slightly. And your authority for that conclusion? Evelyn responded immediately. The interpretation adopted after the appellate clarification issued 3 years ago. A murmur spread quietly through the courtroom. Daniel Pierce felt his eyebrows rise. He remembered reading the clarification during law school. Most people outside the legal profession would never have encountered it. Judge Whitman paused longer this time. The room noticed. Yet rather than acknowledging the growing evidence before him, he chose another path. His pride refused to surrender control of the situation. "Interesting," he said. "You appear to have spent more than some time studying the law." A few restrained laughs emerged from the gallery. They sounded weaker than before. Evelyn simply smiled politely. The judge continued questioning her. One issue led to another. Procedural interpretation became statutory analysis. Statutory analysis led to appellate review. Each time Judge Whitman introduced a more difficult question, Evelyn answered with calm clarity. She never spoke dramatically, never raised her voice, never attempted to impress anyone. She simply explained legal concepts as though discussing familiar subjects. Gradually, something remarkable happened. Nobody laughed anymore. The spectators who had once viewed her as an interruption now watched with genuine fascination. Attorneys who had spent years practicing law were listening carefully. Even court clerk Melissa Grant found herself staring at Evelyn in disbelief. The atmosphere inside courtroom 4B had changed completely. Yet the biggest shift was happening on the bench. For the first time that morning, Judge Harold Whitman was beginning to wonder whether the simple woman sitting before him knew far more than anyone had imagined. Judge Harold Whitman sat silently for a moment after Evelyn Carter answered yet another complex legal question with remarkable precision. The pause was brief, but everyone in courtroom 4B noticed it. Earlier that morning, the judge had controlled the rhythm of every exchange. Now the pace seemed different. The courtroom was no longer watching him alone. Every eye kept returning to the woman seated in the gallery. Evelyn remained exactly as she had from the beginning. Calm, respectful, unmoved by the attention surrounding her. Daniel Pierce could feel the atmosphere changing. Attorneys throughout the room had stopped pretending not to be interested. Some had quietly closed their case files. Others leaned forward in their seats. The legal discussion unfolding before them had become far more compelling than the matters originally scheduled for the morning. Judge Whitman cleared his throat. His expression remained professional, but the confidence that had once bordered on amusement was beginning to fade. "Very well, Ms. Carter," he said. "Let us consider a different issue." He selected a case reference from memory and presented a procedural conflict involving appellate review and jurisdictional authority. It was the kind of question that often generated lengthy debates among experienced attorneys. Several lawyers immediately recognized the complexity of the issue. One attorney quietly whispered to a colleague that he would need several minutes to organize a proper response. Evelyn listened attentively. Then she answered. Her explanation was clear, logical, and concise. She outlined the competing interpretations before explaining why one approach ultimately prevailed. She even identified the reasoning courts had used when resolving similar disputes. The effect on the room was immediate. Nobody shifted in their seats. Nobody whispered. The spectators who had entered the courtroom expecting ordinary proceedings now watched with complete focus. Judge Whitman asked another question, then another. Each became progressively more difficult. Each received the same result. Evelyn answered with quiet confidence, never sounding rehearsed or arrogant. Her knowledge seemed effortless. It was as though the legal principles existed in her mind as naturally as everyday conversation. Court clerk Melissa Grant glanced toward several attorneys seated near the front. Their reactions surprised her. Some were taking notes. Others appeared genuinely impressed. One senior lawyer slowly removed his glasses and stared at Evelyn with disbelief. The woman they had mistaken for an ordinary observer was discussing advanced legal concepts with a level of understanding rarely seen outside academic conferences and appellate courts. Yet what impressed the room most was not simply her intelligence. It was her composure. Evelyn never treated the questions as a competition. She never attempted to embarrass anyone. She answered because she had been asked. Nothing more. Nothing less. Judge Whitman finally introduced a particularly difficult hypothetical involving constitutional interpretation and procedural safeguards. Several attorneys immediately recognized the challenge. The question was designed to test not only legal knowledge but analytical reasoning. Evelyn considered it for several seconds. Then she began explaining her analysis step by step. As she spoke, something extraordinary happened. The room grew completely silent. Even the attorneys stopped taking notes. People simply listened. Her reasoning was so precise and so easy to follow that even non-lawyers in the gallery could understand it. Daniel Pierce felt a smile slowly form. He realized he was witnessing something rare. On the bench, Judge Whitman remained motionless. For the first time that morning, he was no longer searching for weaknesses in Evelyn's answers. He was listening, truly listening. And deep inside, an uncomfortable realization was beginning to take shape. The simple woman he had expected to humiliate was steadily becoming the most respected voice in the courtroom. Judge Harold Whitman could feel the courtroom shifting around him. The change was subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. Earlier that morning, every person in courtroom 4B had looked toward the bench for guidance and authority. Now, whenever a legal question was raised, dozens of eyes instinctively turned toward Evelyn Carter. The realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. For years, he had built his reputation on knowledge, preparation, and confidence. Yet the woman seated in the gallery continued answering increasingly difficult legal questions with remarkable ease. Judge Whitman glanced at the attorneys seated before him. Their reactions were becoming harder to overlook. Some looked impressed. Others looked amazed. One veteran lawyer appeared almost fascinated. The courtroom had stopped viewing Evelyn as an observer. She was becoming the center of attention. Determined to regain control of the proceedings, Judge Whitman straightened in his chair and selected an even more difficult topic. If Evelyn truly possessed exceptional legal knowledge, he intended to find its limits. If she did not, this would finally expose it. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice measured and deliberate, "let us move beyond procedure." The room immediately grew attentive. Suppose a conflict exists between statutory language and judicial interpretation developed over several decades. Which authority should prevail when the text and precedent appear inconsistent? Several attorneys exchanged glances. This was no longer a technical question. It touched on one of the most challenging issues in legal reasoning. Entire seminars had been devoted to debates like this. Spectators sensed the significance even if they did not fully understand the details. Evelyn listened carefully. She rested her hands on the leather folder in her lap and considered the question for several moments. The silence stretched across the courtroom. Then she spoke. Her answer was calm and thoughtful. Rather than choosing a side immediately, she explained the competing principles involved. She described why courts value precedent. She explained why statutory language remains essential. Then she outlined the circumstances under which one might outweigh the other. The explanation was so balanced and precise that several attorneys began taking notes. Judge Whitman listened without interruption. As Evelyn continued, she referenced examples from well-known cases and explained how judicial reasoning had evolved over time. She never sounded rehearsed. She sounded experienced. Daniel Pierce felt genuine disbelief. He had graduated near the top of his law school class and still found himself learning from her analysis. Around the courtroom, the same reaction was spreading. Even people with limited legal knowledge could sense they were witnessing something extraordinary. The discussion no longer resembled a challenge. It resembled a masterclass. Judge Whitman asked a follow-up question. Evelyn answered. He introduced a hypothetical scenario involving constitutional interpretation. She addressed every angle. He modified the facts. She adjusted her reasoning seamlessly. One answer flowed naturally into the next. The courtroom remained completely silent except for their voices. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody shuffled papers. Nobody looked away. Court clerk Melissa Grant quietly watched the exchange unfold. In all her years working in the courthouse, she had never seen anything quite like it. The woman who entered wearing a simple cardigan had transformed the atmosphere of the entire room. Most remarkable of all was her humility. Evelyn never acted superior. She never corrected anyone harshly. She simply shared knowledge when asked. The contrast between her quiet confidence and the growing uncertainty on the bench was becoming impossible to miss. And as Judge Whitman prepared yet another question, a thought was beginning to spread through the courtroom. Perhaps the issue was no longer whether Evelyn Carter understood the law. Perhaps the real mystery was how someone with such extraordinary legal brilliance had remained completely unknown to everyone in the room. The question hanging over courtroom 4B was no longer whether Evelyn Carter understood the law. That question had already been answered. The new question was far more intriguing. Who was she? The courtroom had become so focused on her legal analysis that many people had forgotten how the morning began. Only an hour earlier, she had been viewed as an ordinary citizen sitting quietly in the gallery. Now experienced attorneys were listening to her explanations with the same attention they might give a respected professor or appellate judge. Judge Harold Whitman could feel the shift more clearly than anyone. Each time he introduced a new legal problem, Evelyn responded with clarity and precision. More importantly, she explained difficult concepts in ways that made them understandable to everyone in the room. It was a rare skill. Knowledge alone was impressive. The ability to teach was something else entirely. Determined to maintain his authority, Judge Whitman selected one final challenge. This time he chose a recent appellate dispute that had generated significant debate among legal scholars across the country. Even many practicing attorneys struggled to agree on its implications. Several lawyers in the courtroom immediately recognized the case. One quietly shook his head, wondering how anyone could answer such a question without extensive preparation. Judge Whitman outlined the dispute and then looked directly at Evelyn. The room fell silent. Evelyn listened carefully. She did not open her folder. She did not consult notes. She simply considered the question. Then she began speaking. Her explanation was extraordinary. She broke the issue into its essential components and identified the competing interpretations. She explained the reasoning behind each position before evaluating their strengths and weaknesses. As she continued, attorneys exchanged astonished glances. Some nodded unconsciously. Others stared in disbelief. Daniel Pierce felt as though he were attending a graduate seminar rather than sitting inside a county courtroom. Every answer Evelyn provided seemed to reveal another layer of expertise. Yet the most remarkable moment came near the end of her analysis. Rather than simply discussing the case itself, she identified a potential future consequence that had not yet been addressed by the court's opinion. The observation was subtle, brilliant, and immediately recognizable to anyone with serious legal training. The room went completely silent. One senior attorney froze with his pen suspended above a notebook. Another slowly removed his glasses and stared toward Evelyn. Court clerk Melissa Grant looked from attorney to attorney, sensing that something significant had just happened. On the bench, Judge Whitman remained motionless. For several seconds, he said nothing. He had expected to challenge Evelyn. Instead, she had offered an insight that expanded the discussion beyond the case itself. It was the type of observation legal scholars spent months developing. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on Evelyn Carter. The judge finally spoke. His voice sounded noticeably different than before. That is a very interesting interpretation. It was not criticism. It was not sarcasm. It was respect. For the first time that morning, the authority figure who had dismissed her was openly acknowledging her expertise. Evelyn simply nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." There was no triumph in her voice. No desire to prove anyone wrong. She seemed completely unaware of how extraordinary the moment had become. Around the courtroom, however, the realization was spreading rapidly. This was not merely an intelligent woman. This was someone operating at a level few people in the room had ever encountered. And as the silence lingered beneath the high ceiling of courtroom 4B, one truth became impossible to ignore. The simple woman everyone had underestimated was giving the most impressive legal performance the courthouse had seen in years. The silence inside courtroom 4B felt different now. Earlier, it had been the silence of anticipation. Then it became the silence of curiosity. Now it was the silence of respect. Every person in the room understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Evelyn Carter sat quietly in the same seat she had occupied all morning, yet the atmosphere around her had completely changed. Attorneys who had once dismissed her as an observer now looked at her as a peer. Spectators who had barely noticed her arrival could not take their eyes off her. Even Judge Harold Whitman appeared transformed by the experience. For the first time since the proceedings began, he seemed less interested in testing Evelyn and more interested in understanding her. The judge adjusted several documents on the bench before speaking again. His voice carried a level of professionalism that had been missing earlier. "Ms. Carter," he said, "you have demonstrated an impressive understanding of procedural and constitutional law." The acknowledgement immediately captured the attention of everyone present. Judge Whitman was not known for offering compliments lightly. Evelyn responded with a simple nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge paused. Then he presented a complex legal scenario involving multiple jurisdictions, competing statutory interpretations, and constitutional concerns. It was not merely difficult. It was the type of problem that legal scholars often debated for months. Several attorneys recognized it immediately. One quietly whispered that there was probably no single correct answer. Evelyn listened carefully. She considered the facts. Then she began speaking. What followed felt less like an answer and more like a masterclass in legal reasoning. She identified the underlying principles governing each issue. She explained how different courts might approach the problem. She outlined strengths and weaknesses in competing interpretations. Most importantly, she demonstrated how legal reasoning evolves when facts change. Her explanation was not only correct, it was elegant. The room became completely absorbed. Daniel Pierce found himself writing notes as quickly as possible. Around him, other attorneys were doing the same. Nobody wanted to miss a word. Court clerk Melissa Grant noticed something remarkable. Judge Whitman was taking notes as well. The sight seemed almost impossible. The most respected judge in the courthouse was writing down observations made by the woman he had dismissed earlier that morning. As Evelyn continued, she connected principles from multiple areas of law with remarkable precision. The analysis flowed naturally, as though she could see relationships others overlooked. Several experienced lawyers exchanged astonished looks. They had spent years practicing law and still struggled to follow some of the connections she made so effortlessly. The room went silent once again. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered. Every eye remained fixed on Evelyn. The authority she carried came not from a title or position, but from the depth of her understanding. Judge Whitman eventually lowered his pen and looked directly at her. His expression had changed completely. The confidence that once bordered on arrogance had been replaced by genuine admiration. For several seconds he appeared ready to ask another question. Instead, he simply sat back in his chair. The courtroom noticed. It was a small moment, but a powerful one. The challenge had ended. The contest no longer existed. What remained was the undeniable truth standing before everyone. The simple woman who had entered unnoticed was now commanding the attention of every legal mind in the room. Yet the greatest surprise was still waiting. Because while the courtroom had finally recognized Evelyn's brilliance, nobody yet knew who she truly was. And when that truth emerged, even the most experienced professionals present would struggle to believe it. The courtroom remained remarkably quiet after Evelyn Carter finished her analysis. Even people with no legal background could sense they had witnessed something extraordinary. The atmosphere felt different now. The earlier amusement had disappeared completely. In its place stood genuine admiration and a growing sense of mystery. Judge Harold Whitman sat behind the bench studying the woman before him. For nearly an hour he had challenged her with increasingly complex legal questions. Each time she had responded with calm precision. Each answer had revealed a deeper level of understanding. Yet one question remained unanswered. Who exactly was Evelyn Carter? The judge finally leaned forward. His voice carried none of the sarcasm that had colored their earlier exchanges. "Ms. Carter," he said respectfully, "I believe everyone in this courtroom is wondering the same thing." A few smiles appeared around the room. "How did you acquire such an extraordinary knowledge of the law?" Every eye turned toward Evelyn. Daniel Pierce lowered his pen. Court clerk Melissa Grant stopped organizing files. Attorneys who had spent years practicing law waited silently for her answer. Evelyn smiled softly. For a moment, she seemed reluctant to become the center of attention. Then she opened the worn leather folder that had rested on her lap all morning. From inside, she removed several documents and handed them to a court officer, who delivered them to the bench. Judge Whitman examined the first page. His expression changed instantly. The room noticed. He looked at the second page, then the third. The courtroom grew even quieter. Daniel watched the judge carefully. Something significant had just happened. Judge Whitman slowly lowered the documents and looked back toward Evelyn. The confidence normally visible in his face had been replaced by genuine astonishment. "Goodness," he whispered before catching himself. Several attorneys exchanged confused looks. Nobody understood what the judge had discovered. After a brief pause, Judge Whitman addressed the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "it appears there is something important we should all know." The room became perfectly still. Ms. Carter is not simply someone who studies the law. He glanced at the documents again. She is the author of multiple legal textbooks currently used by law schools throughout the United States. The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Daniel Pierce froze in disbelief. He instantly recognized one of the titles. Every student at his law school had used it. Several attorneys looked stunned. Others stared openly at Evelyn. But the revelations were not finished. Judge Whitman continued reading. She has served as a legal scholar, constitutional advisor, and lecturer at some of the most respected academic institutions in the country. More silence followed. The room seemed incapable of processing the information. The simple woman who had entered unnoticed that morning was not merely knowledgeable. She was one of the most respected legal minds in the nation. Several attorneys slowly shook their heads in disbelief. One senior lawyer quietly laughed at the irony. They had spent the entire morning watching a legal authority explain the law while assuming she was an ordinary spectator. Daniel Pierce felt a rush of embarrassment. He remembered his own assumptions when Evelyn first entered the room. Judge Whitman looked toward her once more. The courtroom could see that he finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. Yet Evelyn remained exactly the same. Calm, humble, unaffected by the attention. She had never mentioned her accomplishments, never introduced her credentials, never attempted to impress anyone. The room went silent again. But this silence was different. It was the silence that follows a truth so surprising that nobody knows what to say next. And as every eye remained fixed on Evelyn Carter, the most respected judge in the courthouse realized that the woman he had underestimated was someone whose work had shaped the education of legal professionals across the entire country. For several moments after the revelation, nobody in courtroom seemed capable of speaking. The silence settled across the room like a living thing. Attorneys stared at Evelyn Carter. Spectators looked from one face to another, searching for confirmation that they had heard correctly. Judge Harold Whitman remained seated behind the bench, the documents still resting before him. The simple woman he had dismissed that morning was not merely knowledgeable. She was one of the legal scholars whose work had influenced generations of attorneys, judges, and law students throughout the country. Daniel Pierce felt both amazed and humbled. He remembered studying one of Evelyn's textbooks during law school. He had highlighted entire chapters and relied on her explanations while preparing for examinations. The realization that she had been sitting quietly in the gallery all morning seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Around the courtroom, similar reactions unfolded. Experienced attorneys who rarely showed emotion now looked genuinely stunned. Yet Evelyn herself appeared unchanged. She remained seated calmly, her hands resting on the worn leather folder that had accompanied her throughout the morning. She neither celebrated the recognition nor appeared interested in the attention. Judge Whitman finally stood from the bench. The movement immediately captured everyone's attention. Throughout his career, he had built a reputation for confidence and authority. Yet now his expression reflected something far more important. Humility. He looked directly at Evelyn. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice steady but sincere, "I owe you an apology." The words echoed through the courtroom. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The judge continued. "When you entered this courtroom today, I made assumptions about you before I knew anything about you." He paused briefly. "Instead of listening, I judged. Instead of asking questions, I reached conclusions." The room remained silent. Evelyn listened respectfully. Judge Whitman took a slow breath. "That was my mistake." The admission carried enormous weight. Attorneys exchanged glances. Court clerk Melissa Grant felt a quiet sense of admiration. It takes confidence to hold authority. It takes character to admit when authority has been misused. Evelyn smiled gently. "Thank you, Your Honor." Her response contained no bitterness, no triumph, no desire to embarrass the man who had publicly underestimated her. She offered grace where many would have offered criticism. The simplicity of that response seemed to affect the courtroom more than any legal argument had. Judge Whitman nodded. "The legal profession would benefit from more people like you." Several attorneys quietly agreed. Daniel Pierce felt inspired by what he was witnessing. Throughout the morning, Evelyn had demonstrated extraordinary intelligence. Yet her greatest strength had not been her knowledge. It had been her dignity. She never raised her voice, never demanded recognition, never used her expertise to humiliate anyone. As the proceedings drew to a close, people slowly gathered their belongings. Conversations resumed, but every discussion centered on the same lesson. Appearances reveal very little. Character reveals everything. Evelyn quietly stood and prepared to leave. Several attorneys approached to thank her for the insights she had shared. Others simply offered respectful nods. She accepted each gesture with warmth and humility. Then she walked toward the courtroom doors. No spotlight followed her. No grand announcement accompanied her departure. She left the same way she had entered, quietly. Yet everyone in the room knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. And as the doors closed behind her, one truth remained. Titles may earn authority. Reputation may earn recognition. But wisdom, humility, and character earn something far greater: respect. And on that day, the smartest person in the courtroom was the one nobody noticed when she first walked in.